Good morning, good afternoon, good evening to each of you participants joining for the Addressing Root Causes of Attacks on Environmental Rights Defenders Through Collective Approach, Challenges and Opportunities for Investors. We are really welcoming you today for this incredible array of participants and also the panelists that you will be hearing shortly. So before turning to the panel, we want to make sure that you can connect connect on translation. So next slide, please. At the bottom of your screen on the right, you'll see a globe. So please click on the globe icon in the menu at the bottom and select your language, either English or Spanish. So hopefully you'll be able to do that and we can move on. So next slide, please. Before I introduce the panel, I want to mention that we will not be getting questions to the panelists until everyone has spoken. And you'll notice that there's a question and answer chat box for putting your questions in. So as you have them during the presentations, we ask you to put your questions there, and at the end, after the panelists have made their presentations, we will be able to turn to questions and answers. We do have an amazing panel, but we want to first say a little bit about the Investor Alliance for Human Rights, one of the sponsors of this program. The Human Rights, Investors Alliance for Human Rights is based on the UN Guiding Principles on Business and Human Rights Framework, and really talking about three basic things: a platform for collective action, for investor responsibility to respect human rights, the corporate engagement that presses responsible business conduct, and standard setting initiatives designed to support public policies on business and human rights. In April, the Investor Alliance, along with the Business and Human Rights Resource Center and the International Service for Human Rights, published Safeguarding Human Rights Defenders, Practical Guidance for Investors. You'll see a link in the chat box to this, this guidance document that is not only applicable to investors, the primary focus, but also to portfolio companies where investors are invested, as well as our colleagues in the non-governmental and indigenous communities globally. We are really honored to sponsor this along with Zero Tolerance Initiative, a coalition led by indigenous peoples, local community representatives, non-governmental organizations which address the root causes and responsibilities of global supply chains in killings and violence against environmental human rights defenders in their communities. ZTI presses companies and investors to implement verifiable and effective zero tolerance commitments and policies against attacks on environmental human rights defenders. The subject, of course, of today's webinar. And we are also honored to have two human rights defenders with us today from the ZT, the Zero Tolerance Initiatives Network. So now I'd like to refer to a really important resource for this agenda and for the work of investors going forward. The the Forest Peoples Program published just recently, Ending Impunity, Confronting the Drivers of violence and forced destructions on the agribusiness and extractives frontier in the Peruvian Amazon. And this I would really refer to you because it has so much important data, not an easy read because of the violence that is taking place against environmental human rights defenders in issues related to land rights and to agriculture, to name two. So today, it's really my pleasure to introduce Ali Hines, senior campaigner from the Global Witness, Guanjun and May from a program coordinator from the Human Rights Campaign and Policy Advocacy Program in Asia Indigenous Peoples Pact from India, and Miguel Ramirez Vasquez, who's president of the Federation for the Native Communities of Ucayali and its tributaries, Feconao. And might I say a special welcome to Miguel. We found out last week, Miguel, that you and your family were experiencing serious death threats, and you had to move from your home to another safer location. So we're so thankful that you are here and that your presence here represents the tragic conditions that human rights defenders and environmental human rights defenders are in. So please, we want to convey our thoughts and prayers to you and your family and all others that are fighting for rights that will protect communities. And finally, Stephen Heim, advocate for the rights of Indigenous peoples for many years, the managing director at Boston Common Asset Management. And so we are just so thankful to have 4 of you with us for this day. So Ali, take us away. And next slide, please.
Thank you.
Next slide.
So I will just talk about Global Witness briefly and our work on land and environmental defenders. And I'll give a top-line overview of the global context for defenders. And then I'll just talk through the due diligence process that we expect companies and investors to be undertaking to protect defenders. So Global Witness is a non-for-profit international organisation. We're based in London. We've got smaller offices in Beijing, in Brussels, and Washington, DC. We campaign on the links between natural resources, conflict, corruption, and associated environmental and human rights abuses. So we're a research and advocacy organisation, and we work with local partners across the world to investigate and advocate for change at the national and international level. So we have a long history of working particularly on commodity supply chains and international standards and initiatives. Next slide, please. So the Land and Environmental Defenders team, it's been going for about 8 years. And what we mean by land and environmental defenders is anyone that takes a peaceful stand, and that can be in their personal or professional capacity against the often unjust or discriminatory exploitation of their land and natural resources. So that could be communities protesting against pollution from a mine. It could be others supporting such efforts through their work. So for example, lawyers, politicians, civil society organisations. So our team at Global Witness works with local partners globally to gather data on the killings of environmental defenders, and we publish that data in an annual report along with wider trends and themes, including on non-lethal attacks against defenders. Next slide, please. So I'll just give an overview of, this is the data from 2019 on defenders. which exposed that 4 defenders were killed on average every week in 2019. So that's 212 deaths globally. But we know that the real figure is likely to be much higher because cases are often not recorded, they're rarely investigated. If you think of countries or regions with very repressive regimes, so for example, China, Russia, we just can't get the data in those places. The same with very rural, remote areas. Deaths are also just the sharp end of what's happening. Many more defenders are attacked, they're jailed, they often face smear campaigns due to their work. So over 2/3 of killings took place in Latin America last year. That's consistently been ranked as the worst region since we began publishing the data in 2012. The Amazon, of course, being a hotspot. And Southeast Asia has consistently been ranked as one of the worst regions for attacks. In terms of drivers, you can see that mining and agribusiness are the top 2 drivers, and they again have consistently been so since we started collecting the data. So widespread impunity makes it very difficult to identify perpetrators, but state security forces play a prominent role, as do private actors such as hitmen, criminal gangs, landowners. Next slide, please. So we've identified the following factors as principal root causes of threats to environmental defenders, typically when companies are involved in large-scale natural resource extraction projects. And that's when companies fail to undertake adequate due diligence in high-risk countries, when they fail to identify and respect customary and collective land rights, which can cause social conflict, when they fail to respect the process of free, prior and informed consent, and when they exclude communities from other decision-making processes. Next slide, please. So the legal framework which companies should be adhering to is the UN Guiding Principles on Business and Human Rights, which states that businesses have an independent responsibility from states to respect human rights, and that includes refraining from harming human rights defenders. The UN Declaration on Human Rights Defenders bolsters the guiding principles alongside the OECD guidance for multinational enterprises and the UN Sustainable Development Goals. So alongside these corporate responsibility guidance, you also have national and international standards which exist to protect defenders' rights. So France's due diligence law being the most recent one. We also have European investors are now bound by due diligence legislation, which means that investors must now disclose the steps that they've taken to address any adverse social and environmental impacts of their investment decisions. And then we're hoping over the next couple of years to see the EU introduce mandatory due diligence legislation, which should include protections for defenders and should apply to financial institutions and investors as well. Next slide, please. So I'm just going to talk through the risk assessment process which companies and investors should be taking, which is based on the OECD guidance 6-step due diligence process and is also based on the UN guiding principles. So the first is ensuring that companies have a defenders policy in the first place and making sure that that's properly embedded into the company's management systems. It should include, so a policy position on defenders should include 2 sets of principles. So those that promote and protect the rights of environmental defenders and those that address the underlying causes such as respecting land rights, undertaking environmental and social impact assessments. So this policy should be developed in consultation with defenders and their communities. And it should include zero tolerance on threats or violence towards defenders and commitment to free, prior and informed consent. I'm also going to outline specifically what investors should be doing. So investors should be screening their portfolios for human rights defenders related risks, including to environmental defenders, and they should establish early warning systems to detect and prevent any potential conflicts. They should include contractual provisions to ensure compliance with and reporting on their company's human rights defenders policy, and outline any reprisal prevention measures. Disclosure provisions should be written into contracts to ensure project transparency, and investors should themselves be independently verifying that projects have secured and maintained the free, prior and informed consent of Indigenous people and communities. Next slide, please. So to assess environmental defender specific risks, companies need to consider risks at 3 levels. So the country level, at the level of specific suppliers and contractors, and at the project level. And any risk assessment, it should be an ongoing process, not just a one-off tick box exercise at the beginning of a project or business relationship. And regular national risk assessments should include the following. So the situation of civic freedoms and human rights defenders in the country, statutory and customary land rights, so the legal procedures for land acquisition, and any relevant environmental laws and policies. Next slide, please. So a business has a responsibility to act not only if it has caused human rights abuses, but also if it has contributed to or is in some way linked to such abuses, whether that be through direct operations or relationships. So businesses should be tailoring their responses to the circumstances of each cases to make sure that solutions are appropriate and effective, and this should be done in consultation with the defenders and their representatives as well. So the following are 5 generic steps that businesses should be taking to identify case-specific measures. Firstly is verifying the reality and severity to the risk of defenders or their communities, and identifying any potential prevention or mitigation measures. Verifying the degree of business involvement. Identifying the risks or costs of inaction versus inaction to your business and to the defenders and their communities, and identifying how the business can best use its leverage to support defenders. And then where ceasing production or operations is necessary, making sure that there's a clear roadmap towards the same. Next slide, please. So investors on this particular point should be adopting and disclosing a protocol for responding to threats and attacks against defenders associated with companies in their portfolios, and that should include the following steps. So consulting with the defenders at risk and any of their supporting organisations to assess the ongoing risks they face, agreeing a response plan with them, requiring any implicated companies to take measures to prevent and mitigate any further harms, using appropriate compliance measures and sanctions. So for example, the suspension of any funding or lending until a safe environment for defenders is guaranteed, and then using their own influence with other financial institutions to apply collective pressure on the implicated companies. Next slide, please. So businesses should also be regularly monitoring the effectiveness of their due diligence process in relation to defenders. And if they're not adequate, they should be adjusting them, developing stronger mechanisms. And again, this monitoring should be conducted in consultation with defenders as their communities, as well as independent experts. Companies should be disclosing and reporting on risks that they've identified and steps they've taken to address these risks. And lastly is access to remedy. So companies should have their own grievance mechanisms in place that are equipped to deal with the specific nature of defenders' grievances. However, I'm sure we'll hear about this later, but obviously threats to defenders can be very urgent, very serious. So companies should be assessing whether their existing grievance processes can respond rapidly enough to prevent any escalation of these threats. And if not, they should be establishing a separate rapid response grievance mechanism that deals specifically with such complaints. And on this point, investors should be ensuring that defenders and their communities associated with companies in their portfolios can have access to such grievance mechanisms, as well as to any independent accountability mechanisms. Sorry, I missed a slide step. Next slide, please. So that's just a very top line overview of the due diligence process. Just to signpost to further information, there's much more detail on a briefing which we put out earlier in the year for businesses and investors called Responsible Sourcing. And we launched this in conjunction with an investor-specific briefing from the Business and Human Rights Resource Centre. And then on risk assessment, there's a lot of really useful detail in a report that came out last year, which was aimed specifically at development finance institutions. But as I said, it's very good for risk assessment details. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Ali. That was really, really important. I mean, giving us a kind of a baseline of the data and also the drivers, but what the process, what can companies and investors do in terms of implementing the human rights due diligence process. So we very much appreciate your intervention here as we begin this conversation. Very important. So next slide, please. We're really delighted that Guan Chung is with us today. She is a Naga indigenous woman from Manipur, India, focusing on issues related to indigeneity, indigenous peoples' movements, indigenous data sovereignty, which is absolutely a critical issue, land rights, and of course, indigenous human rights defenders. So Guan Chung, we look forward to your presentation. Thank you. Next slide.
Thank you very much, David, for the wonderful introduction. Yes, so I will be presenting on the case for collective approach to protection of environment and human rights defenders, basically by presenting the work of the Zero Tolerance Initiative to understand the importance of why such global coalition is important and much needed at this point in time. So next slide, please. So yes, I mean, David has given a brief introduction earlier, but I'll go into the detail of how, what Zero Tolerance Initiative is. So what is Zero Tolerance Initiative? So as you can see, it is the global coalition led by indigenous peoples themselves, Afro-descendant communities, local community representatives, and supportive NGOs. And we are working collectively towards addressing the root causes of killings and violence against human rights defenders linked to global supply chains. So how we do it is by pressing business and investors to make zero tolerance commitments to reprisals against environment and human rights defenders, as well as to enact policies to support these commitments. And also by pressing states to implement and improve statutory regulation and working to strengthen community resilience so that they have a strong basis from which to hold economic actors to account. So why the need for this zero tolerance initiative? But we have seen that in 2018, we all know that that is the 20th anniversary of the UN Declaration on Human Rights Defenders. And what we have seen in the 2 decades of its declaration is that there has been efforts and initiatives to protect defenders by governments, international organizations, institutions, and private sector. And these have multiplied in great detail. But what we have also witnessed is that the number of attacks against defenders and communities, criminalization, intimidation, threats, and killings have also increased, as Ali has made very clearly in her presentation earlier. So that was the reason. I mean, of course, there is not a correct time for this coalition to be built, but of course, last year in 2019, the communities have come together to establish this and to pledge the Zero Tolerance Initiative. So, so this was the reason that we came together to further strengthen our capacities to hold states and businesses accountable, and also we realized the importance of collaboration, strengthening alliances, and building partnerships with other organizations and social movements, and so that together, where we share our common goals of upholding and defending human rights and protecting ourselves and territories and global environment. So the urgent need for direct and effective actions was felt to tackle the roots of the threats and violence against the defenders. So what the Zero Tolerance Initiative believes is that the future initiatives as such and the solidarity is effectively aiming at defending the defenders of the land and environment have to be based on strengthening the capacities of individuals and communities to protect themselves, and building up on the approaches that we already are working on, and also to create community-based protection systems, as well as to consolidate our alliances and networks, and to carry out community-based ground truthing to inform and denounce illegal practices and violations of our rights. So next slide, please. So, so you will see in the Zero Tolerance Initiative website. So there's an elaborate Geneva Declaration that was launched last year in 2019 during the Business and Human Rights Forum, calling upon the states and private sectors to pledge zero tolerance, and also extensive recommendations from these communities for states and private sectors. So you can refer to those really important resources available in Zero Tolerance Initiative website. And there are reports and there are emblematic cases as well, which is documented, and other resources that are curated in the Zero Tolerance Initiatives, which are really important documents that you can refer to. Next slide, please. Yes, so there are principles and the governance structures that the Zero Tolerance Initiative function on. The basic and the core principles that we have, as you see, is collective action to catalyze collective impact, recognition of human rights, self-determination, prior informed consent, meaningful participation in decision spaces that affect communities, and access to independent accountability, protection, redress, and grievance mechanisms that we have identified as the core principles for this initiative. And the governance is comprised of three tiers, where we have the steering group and the ZTI coalition. We have the steering group, and there's a coordination group. So in the last presentation, we'll be presenting on how you can be part of this important initiative as well. Next slide, please. So, so the Zero Tolerance Initiative is layered into three strategy, where the first one is the Community Knowledge and Learning Network, where the support for capacity building and strengthening of knowledge, and on the topic of community resilience, communities, so that communities are better be able to respond to and to recover from adversities that they face. And that's one layer of strategy. And one is the solidarity network that we have identified, where this is a support collective advocacy in response to calls for solidarity from indigenous peoples, Afro-descendants, and local communities affected by company, investors, activities, or to push for policy reform and change at state level. So, and the next one is a platform for coordinated advocacy, where the Zero Tolerance Initiative will coordinate agreed collaborative advocacy towards targets that are identified as impact multipliers for change in business and investor practices related to environment and human rights defenders. So these are three strategies that we have identified. These are identified, and these are working strategies that we have, and every year there will be a review of this strategy, and the steering community will take decisions on depending on the responses that we receive. Next slide, please. Yes, so how does anyone join this ZTI coalition, the steering group or coordination? So in order to become a member of the ZTI coalition, you must be representative of indigenous peoples or a local community, a civil society organization or an NGO. Members must endorse the core values exemplified in the Geneva Declaration. Organizations or people who wish to become members of ZTI are reviewed by the coordination group and the steering group. Members are encouraged to share their name or logo in the ZTI website, but that is not a necessity. Information on ZTI ongoing work will be shared with all members by the coordination group, and they will be invited to participate in activities of the coalition, as well as to attend coordination group meetings when relevant. They can choose how to engage they are with the ongoing work. So the principles of ZTI work, that all activities undertaken under the ZTI logo must uphold the principles of the Geneva Declaration, reflect the priorities of indigenous peoples and local communities, and it must align with the annual strategy approved by the steering group. So, so these are the principles and the membership criteria on which you can join the Zero Tolerance Initiative. And to end my presentation, I would like to urge all of you to join us in our principles and values, align with yours, and to join the Zero Tolerance Initiative. And I would like to end my presentation by asking everyone present here to pledge zero tolerance on attacks against environment and human rights defenders, and uphold and protect each other's right, and the respect must continue. Thank you so much, David. I end my presentation here.
Guan Chung, thank you so much. And you have helped the participants in this webinar understand the critical role of the Zero Tolerance Initiative, really rooted in indigenous peoples, local communities, working with non-governmental organizations, and I think really trying to build much more participation in these this coalition from investors. So that's the real focus of our attention, and I really love the sort of the collective action to catalyze collective impact, because that's really critical across the board, but especially with the issues that you have outlined. So thank you so much, Wanchang. And now it's again a privilege to introduce Miguel, who is the president of the Federation, FECNAU, and also FECNAU is a member of the Zero Tolerance Initiative Steering Committee. It's so important, Miguel, that you're here, and our, obviously our hearts go out to you, to your communities. You are working with some 30 native communities in the Peruvian Amazon, and this work is so important and so dangerous. So we need to support you. We need to support in very concrete ways, and we are very much open to hearing your presentation and to absorbing what you are doing and what so many others are doing day after day after day, that we need to come to your, to be a part of that solidarity with you. So Miguel, we're open to your presentation now. Thank you. Next slide.
Muchas gracias, David. Para mí es un honor estar presente en este evento tan importante. Creo que estos espacios nos fortalecen para seguir con nuestra lucha, ¿no? Entonces, para empezar, nosotros, los pueblos indígenas, vemos la Amazonía o la naturaleza, hay una relación espiritual, ¿no? No es un bosque que hay que destruir porque necesitamos recursos económicos, ¿no? Entonces creo que es un espacio donde nosotros desarrollamos nuestros conocimientos, ¿no? De generación en generación. El siguiente diapositiva, por favor. Entre las causas principales de los ataques contra defensores indígenas en la Amazonía peruana es la inseguridad territorial, ¿no? Que es clave para nosotros. Muchas comunidades en Ucayali y en otras regiones de la Amazonía peruana enfrentan una serie de problemas debido a la falta de reconocimiento por parte del Estado, ¿no? Que en cambio negocia y otorga derechos sobre sus tierras a terceros. La siguiente página, por favor. Los territorios que ocupamos los pueblos indígenas, en este caso el pueblo Shipibo, desde tiempos ancestrales, hoy en día se encuentra bajo amenaza, ¿no? Por diferentes actividades, ¿no? Agronegocios, narcotráfico, ¿no? Que es muy preocupante en estos momentos para nosotros, ¿no? Porque el espacio donde nosotros creemos o que nos hemos habitado durante muchos años está recibiendo amenazas muy fuertes, ¿no? Entonces creo que amerita también seguir o ir articulando trabajos a nivel mucho más grande, ¿no? Entonces, el siguiente diapositiva, por favor. Y a las empresas responsables, nosotros directamente podemos mencionar Sur, ¿no? En el Perú, la sociedad matriz de Sur, con sede en Bermudas, ¿no? Los inversores principales de los cuales tenemos conocimiento son ANOL, ¿no? USA y Amerra, fondos de inversión privada con sede en los Estados Unidos. Estos grupos siguen desarrollando sus actividades e inversiones en el territorio de la comunidad, mientras que la deforestación sigue aumentando. Nosotros no estamos en contra de los inversores, pero que siempre y cuando respeten los derechos colectivos que tienen los pueblos indígenas, ¿no? Pueden hacer sus actividades sin despojar a los pueblos indígenas que habitan allí, ¿no? En este caso, estas empresas no están cumpliendo, ¿no? Lo que hacen es destruir nuestra naturaleza, destruir nuestros territorios, contaminar las aguas, ¿no? Que son parte de nuestra convivencia diaria, ¿no? Entonces, es sumamente preocupante esta situación que estamos enfrentando, ¿no? El siguiente diapositiva, por favor. Todo lo que ocasionan estos grandes empresas o actividades son lo que podemos ver en la imagen, ¿no? O sea, es una destrucción total, ¿no? Porque no solo destruyen los bosques, ¿no? También destruyen los animales o los seres vivos que habitan en esos lugares, ¿no? Entonces, es una irresponsabilidad de parte de estas empresas que lo único que hacen es irresponsablemente destruir, ¿no? Todo lo que nos ha servido para asegurar nuestra existencia, ¿no? El siguiente diapositiva, por favor. En este proceso, los líderes de la comunidad, y no solo de Santa Clara de Uchuña, que es un caso emblemático, sino también los directivos de FECONAU, hemos experimentado amenazas, ataques por defender su territorio, sus derechos, ¿no? Podemos mencionar nuevamente la empresa Ochosur SAP, ¿no? Para evadir de sus responsabilidades de todo lo que ha hecho, o sea, ha cambiado inclusive de razón social, ¿no? Antes se llamaba plantaciones Pucallpa, ahora por los múltiples atropellos de los derechos colectivos a los pueblos indígenas, ahora se llama Ochosur, ¿no? Entonces tiene aliados entre los élites políticos económicos de Ucayali, incluyendo los medios, ¿no? O sea, todas estas actividades para seguir haciendo sus actividades de manera irregular, irresponsable, lo que hacen es aliarse, ¿no? Con el propio Estado para que pueda manejar a su interés todo lo que puede ser en beneficio de la empresa, ¿no? Entonces, no está viendo el derecho o los derechos colectivos que tienen los pueblos indígenas, sino cómo generar el ingreso económico día a día, ¿no? O sea, a la empresa lo único que busca es ir aumentando sus ingresos, pero no ve cómo afecta a los pueblos que están en estos territorios, ¿no? Siguiente diapositiva, por favor. Nosotros, los defensores, en este caso, seguimos luchando, ¿no? Buscando estrategias cómo resistir, ¿no? Por las dinámicas del despojo que hacen las actividades o en todo caso estas empresas que no respetan a los pueblos indígenas, ¿no? Las estrategias que se viene usando para resistir el despojo de sus tierras, ¿no? Es una acción directa en defensa del territorio, justicia indígena, autolideramiento, incidencia hacia el Estado, ¿no? Autoridades regionales, nacionales, ¿no? Denuncias ante las fiscalías, demanda de amparo ante el Tribunal Constitucional, incidencia hacia empresas, quejas formales, ¿no? La RCPO, ¿no? Por ejemplo, contra plantaciones de Pucallpa, luego Olpesa, Alicor, por haber comprado su palma de las tierras despojadas de los pueblos, ¿no? Entonces, estas estrategias que estamos utilizando ya es mucho tiempo, ¿no? Pero hasta ahora sin resultados concretos, no podemos mencionar. El siguiente diapositiva, por favor. ¿no? Bueno, puedo aquí mencionar algunas situaciones, ¿no? Limitaciones al acceso a la justicia. Durante muchos años el Estado no ha cumplido su deber de reconocer territorios indígenas, ¿no? Es uno de los problemas por lo que estamos pasando en estos momentos críticos, ¿no? Mientras que no titula, entrega derechos a otros, pues a pesar de obligaciones legales, no existen mecanismos de salvaguarda para territorios indígenas no titulados, ¿no? Permitiendo la sobreposición de derechos y el conflicto, ¿no? La corrupción en los procesos judiciales. Las fiscalías no tienen recursos ni voluntad para investigar casos. No hay transparencia sobre las empresas y sus beneficiarios. Muchos están registrados en paraísos fiscales con reglas que restringen el acceso a la información. Este último es, a veces cuando estos tipos de empresas violan los derechos colectivos que tienen los pueblos indígenas, es muy difícil para nosotros como comunidades locales saber de dónde vienen los fondos, ¿no? Pero igualmente durante más de 5 años de investigación, nosotros finalmente a lo menos tenemos algunos datos de dónde vienen estos fondos, ¿no? Pero en muchos casos es difícil saber dónde hacer la incidencia, ¿no? O sea, por eso decía que nosotros no estamos en contra de las actividades que puedan hacer las empresas, ¿no? Pero siempre lo que pedimos es respeten el espacio donde nosotros estamos habitando hace muchísimos años, ¿no? Pero en este caso alguien viene y dice, esto es mío porque tengo este documento que me otorga el Estado, ¿no? Y nosotros que habitamos muchos años, el simple hecho de no tener un documento que sustente que yo vivo muchos años ahí, nuestros derechos son violados, no respetados a pesar de que nosotros vivimos muchos años en estos lugares, ¿no? Entonces, el siguiente diapositiva, por favor. La comunidad Ifeconau ha tenido que enfrentar muchos desafíos durante más de 6 años, ¿no? De lucha, ¿no? Esto incluye las amenazas y violencia, la lentitud del sistema jurídico. Estamos más de 5 años en el caso de Santa Clara de Uchuña. Desde las primeras denuncias, mientras que la deforestación sigue aumentando, las dificultades de determinar exactamente quiénes están invirtiendo, beneficiando la destrucción de sus territorios y la ausencia de mecanismos fuertes para exigir rendición de cuentas a los actores responsables, ¿no? Es muy difícil a veces, como decía, ¿no? O sea, ¿dónde y en qué momento tengo que hacer las incidencias para que los inversores también puedan tomar sus decisiones y no seguir apoyando a las empresas que destruyen la naturaleza, destruyen la supervivencia de los pueblos, ¿no? No solo eso, ¿no? Entonces, asesinan, es lo más lamentable, a pesar de en esta crisis mundial de salud que hemos vivido, han sido asesinados más de 3 hermanos nuestros, ¿no? Entonces, nuestra lucha es difícil, es muy complicado, pero en esa lucha seguimos avanzando, ¿no? El siguiente... bueno, la siguiente, por favor, porque esto ya he mencionado. En la siguiente. Bueno, finalmente puedo dar algunas recomendaciones para seguir en este proceso de lucha que estamos llevando, ¿no? Establecer mecanismos de salvaguarda de territorios indígenas no titulados, es lo que nosotros, bueno, exigimos. Mientras no esté titulado nuestros territorios, ¿cómo hacemos que otras personas, el Estado les puede otorgar derechos, ¿no? Donde nosotros todavía estamos habitando? ¿Cómo salvaguardamos un territorio ancestral que no está reconocido por el Estado. Establecer vía judicial, ¿no?, especial para pueblos indígenas en conflictos territoriales, ¿no?, que muchas veces las instituciones del Estado desconocen, ¿no?, la existencia de los pueblos indígenas. Permitir a los pueblos indígenas involucrarse en procesos de daños ambientales. Es una recomendación que nosotros hemos visto conveniente desde CONAU. Dotar a las fiscalías con recursos adecuados para que puedan hacer una diligencia real, ¿no?, en un momento adecuado. Brindar fondos flexibles a comunidades y defensores criminalizados para que defiendan sus derechos con recursos legales, ¿no? Entonces, el siguiente presentación, por favor. Bueno, pues en resumen, la empresa de Denis Melca cambiaron de razón social de plantaciones de Pucallpasac a 8 Sursa, ¿no?, por evadir sus responsabilidades, aún teniendo pruebas suficientes que ha violado los derechos colectivos que tienen los pueblos indígenas. Plantaciones de Pucallpasac se retiró de la membresía de la RCPO, ¿no?, antes que la entidad emita su informe final. El Tribunal Constitucional, este caso, el caso emblemático de la comunidad Santa Clara de Uchuña, está en el Tribunal Constitucional, 2 años, no hay fallo. Nosotros exigimos, o en todo caso estamos pendientes de cuál va a ser el fallo final del Tribunal Constitucional, un ente máximo, ¿no?, que tiene que manifestarse, ¿no?, o decir su decisión final. Mientras que nosotros esperamos este fallo, las comunidades siguen viviendo en situaciones complicadas, siguen recibiendo amenazas, ¿no? Entonces, la situación se vuelve caótico, ¿no? Mientras que no se resuelva esta situación, no podemos caminar libremente en el territorio que fue nuestro, ¿no? No podemos realizar las actividades de pesca, no podemos hacer las actividades de cultivo, ¿no? Entonces, nos limitan muchas cosas, lo que nosotros hemos desarrollado nuestras actividades de manera libre, ¿no? Pero ahora esos detalles es para nosotros complicado. No podemos producir, no podemos caminar libremente, ¿no? Son situaciones que tenemos que enfrentar mientras la decisión o el Estado se manifiesta. La Relatoría emitió un informe amicus exigiendo al Tribunal Constitucional que establezca el territorio de la comunidad Santa Clara de Uchuña, ¿no? Pues, todavía no hemos tenido una respuesta de parte del Tribunal Constitucional. El siguiente diapositiva, por favor. Bueno, hay algunos, no, esa un poco ha sido mi presentación. Creo que es importante articular el trabajo, ¿no? Porque es importante. Nosotros solos como pueblos indígenas en la Amazonía no vamos a poder lograr con éxito lo que estamos buscando, ¿no? La única forma de seguir resistiendo en este esfuerzo, en esta lucha, es articular trabajos con instituciones como que estamos viendo ahora, ¿no? Para que la problemática de los pueblos indígenas o la situación que estamos enfrentando los pueblos indígenas sea cada más visible, ¿no? Y en base a esta situación podamos caminar juntos, ¿no? Podamos buscar estrategias de cómo enfrentar los retos que tenemos los pueblos indígenas para que no existan más defensores de derechos humanos o defensores de tierra, bosques, sean asesinados cruelmente, y que esto en el camino no tenga una respuesta concreta de parte del Estado, ¿no? Para que no quede impugne estos delitos, queremos que la comunidad internacional, ¿no?, o los aliados internacionales puedan también articular el trabajo que estamos haciendo las organizaciones indígenas, ¿no? Estoy muy agradecido tener este espacio, tener este diálogo con ustedes, ¿no? Para nosotros es fundamental estar en este espacio, ¿no? Mi situación que estoy pasando ahora es complicado porque finalmente son varios frentes que estamos enfrentando, ¿no? O sea, es narcotráfico, expansión de monocultivos, corrupción, tráfico de tierras. Entonces, FECONAU es una organización que viene trabajando más de 40 años y vamos a seguir haciendo nuestro trabajo, cumpliendo con el rol que nos han encomendado nuestras comunidades. Y aquí agradecer nuevamente a ustedes y a Forest Program People que viene acompañando nuestra lucha, que es un aliado importante, cercano, que nos permite también llevar estos mensajes hacia afuera, ¿no? Eso sería mi presentación. Muchas gracias. Si hay algún comentario o pregunta, estoy dispuesto a contestar.
Miguel, thank you so much for the presentation. I mean, you gave us a seriously deep and profound understanding of what it looks like on the ground. And when one thinks of a company like Ocho Sur, who is so irresponsible that every single thing that any community needs to depend upon is destroyed, the nature, the land, the water, the animals and living beings in the Amazon. So I think your recommendations are really critical. And as investors, we need to think through how best we can support. So this webinar is not like just one webinar, but you have really challenged the investor community to be a part of the kind of the solidarity with FECONAU and all the other activities through the Zero Tolerance Initiative and Global Witness. So we will be communicating with you, and we wish you and your family the best. So now let's get on to Stephen Himes. So next slide, please. Stephen has been a long-time active member of the Interfaith Center on Corporate Responsibility, and now with the Investor Alliance for Human Rights, our initiative, and has been seriously focused in a concrete way with the indigenous peoples in the US and the Amazon, et cetera. So in a few minutes, Stephen, could you present your investor perspective on this critical issue? Stephen, next slide, please.
Thank you, David. It's an honor to participate with everyone on this webinar today. We're really trying to educate each other, as investors, and hear from some of the terrific speakers that we just heard from. So I work for Boston Common Asset Management. As David said, we're a member of ICCR and also the IHR network, and also mention the Investors and Indigenous Peoples Working Group, which is a group open to any investors or others that would like to work on advocacy. We have monthly conference calls. Boston Common is a global investor. We don't invest in a lot of the companies that Miguel mentioned, either as private equity companies or smaller publicly traded companies in other markets. We do invest in countries throughout the world, and that's why this whole key for the Zero Tolerance Initiative is on the supply chain part of it, as we have to look at the global brands that are buying the palm oil or the oil and gas companies or forestry products or others that Miguel noted in Guangzhou, also in Southeast Asia. I guess I'll note too that just to give a quick response to our speakers and then have a few maybe lessons learned. Allie in Global Witness, a key thing for me was on the due diligence process, step by step. She laid out what some of the causes were and has very great resources for all of us to consider. I wanted to add to another one in the mix of references is the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. That's also a key and understanding it's not just the issue of free, prior, informed consent or approval, really of self-determination for Indigenous peoples, and whether governments are upholding that in businesses or companies and banks that seek to operate in those areas are upholding the rights of Indigenous peoples for self-determination. For Guanjun, I'd say key things I heard was on the ZTI pledge as for investors to take, and also I would say something we could ask banks that we work with. The global banks recently updated last year the Equator Principles, and that's supposed to guide their project finance, and Indigenous people's rights was a key area that was added, though it wasn't as strong as it needed to be. It also recommend looking at the ending impunity report from ZTI. And then Miguel, he talked about the key issue of land tenure and the government not respecting their rights of being on the land for centuries, and instead giving it the rights to others to come in. And therefore it's key for investors and banks to press governments and the countries of what the investors can do is to press them using a lot of different tools, which many of our participants I know are active in ICCR and know tools, but I just want to relay them quickly for everyone. One is to use your shares in companies to get Indigenous speakers to speak at annual shareholder meetings. That's been a powerful way over the years with different companies that we've helped support Indigenous people, such as at ConocoPhillips. Filing shareholder proposals for US companies and Canadian companies. Organizing with other investors, such as the IHR and the Investors in Indigenous Peoples Working Group. Investor statements and letters to companies and governments. IHR did that last year to the Philippines, and the attacks on human rights defenders. And also looking at Wall Street and Wall Street analysts and really telling them what the risks are that are happening. The other thing I would note is that First Peoples Worldwide, which is based at the University of Colorado, has a very good free, prior, informed consent due diligence questionnaire, which is very helpful for investors. I'd add that to the other resources that Ali mentioned, and also the whole responsibility of investigating, verifying what are the mitigation steps that companies or banks need to do, and what's the involvement of the company that you are looking at in the supply chain. It seems like that's the key area here. And I'll give just one example of our community in Ecuador in Block 23. There they had many death threats for their leaders. The Ecuadorian military actually flew in a helicopter with armed troops to threaten them, to support oil development. Finally, they got actual protective measures ordered by the Inter-American Court for Human Rights. I think that's the name, and they actually had military troops that were responsible for guarding, protecting them. So I'll just say that it's a critical issue for investors, and we have a lot of good resources, and I'm looking forward to IHR and ICCR continuing to have these dialogues and education for investors. Thank you.
Stephen, thanks so much for this presentation and for kind of summarizing some of the issues that we've been discussing today, plus the resources, and also for your commitment within the investor community to really pay attention to these issues and have become a kind of a model for other investors to really actively engage on the ground with Indigenous peoples, with communities, et cetera. So thanks so much. We now have about, I would say, like 10 minutes for the Q&A section. If you have a question, there's the question and answer box at the lower part of the screen. There's one here for you, Ali. Do you have disaggregated data on the number of Indigenous peoples, human rights defenders killed in 2019?
Yes. So I should have noted that Indigenous people and women are disproportionately affected when it comes to these investments. I think for 2019, Indigenous people made up about 40% of the killings. It's typically between 40 and 60%, we find, which is telling. But yeah, that information will be in the annual report for reference.
A question for you, Miguel. So there's some such positive organizing on the ground for safety to protect land, particularly lands that are not under kind of formal ownership. What can government do to support the safeguarding of lands by community groups that you're a part of? What can investors do to support that really important function on the ground? Miguel.
Gracias por la pregunta. Pienso que el Estado lo que tiene que hacer es buscar mecanismos de reconocer los territorios ancestrales que tienen los pueblos indígenas, que en este caso no está pasando. Los trámites son muy burocráticos, demoran más de 3, 5 años, mientras que para un privado es más rápido, ¿no? O sea, ahí surgen los problemas, mientras que los pueblos indígenas buscan por años su reconocimiento. Alguien que viene y tiene recursos, lo están reconociendo de manera más rápida, ¿no? Y eso es uno. Y los inversores tienen que saber primero dónde van a invertir, ¿no? Para que los recursos que ellos ponen no estén haciendo trabajos despojando territorios indígenas, ¿no? Que no respetando los derechos colectivos que tienen los pueblos indígenas. En este caso lo que está pasando, la empresa que he mencionado, ¿no? Entonces nosotros creemos que los inversores en este caso primero tienen que saber dónde van sus fondos o sus recursos, ¿no? Eso sería mi pregunta, mi respuesta.
Thank you so much. So, Quan Chung, how would investors get engaged and involved in the Zero Tolerance Initiative programs and get information from the ZTI on a regular basis to help them understand and activate their investments in the area of protecting environmental human rights defenders?
Yes, thank you, David. I think it is very important that the investors pledge to this zero tolerance initiative, and that I think I think the investors should be very, like Miguel was saying, that they should be very aware where their resources are going, and that they should have, I think, have proper mechanisms in place where they can invest to conduct and act on human rights due diligence assessments, and engage with the clients to adopt and implement due diligence wherever possible. So in engaging with the ZTI initiative, either they can reach out to us, and yeah, I mean, yeah,
Thank you so much. A question for you, Stephen Heim. How do investors pinpoint the existence of land conflicts so often associated with violent conflict and repression under their existing systems of due diligence?
That's very challenging, and also shows the lack of information from the environmental social governance data providers that a lot of investors rely on in evaluating companies. So that's the importance of the due diligence. I think first is just note what Ali presented earlier of where are the killings happening. If a company is operating in those countries, that's an issue that you have to be concerned about. What's happening? Are they doing their own human rights due diligence for operating in that country? The other is, I think the Zero Tolerance Initiative will be a great resource for us, and also the reports from the Forest Peoples Group and Global Witness and the Business and Rights Human Resource Center. They have a good database that you can type in a company name, because we really are trying to find out what's happening on the ground. And that's very difficult as investors if we're located in the US or Europe or Japan or other countries. So that's what I would say is we have to really work on networking and to network with other investors to find out and try to educate each other.
Thank you so much. We've come to the end of the webinar. We just have a few minutes left. First, I again want to thank all the 4 panelists for their, not only their comments, but their deep commitment to this issue. It's not just about commitment, it's about action. And, you know, as was said earlier, Kwan Jung, the collective action for collective impact and catalyzing that is really important. Several things. One, the information from this webinar, this has been recorded, and we will get this out to all the participants, and that will include the links to a number of the resources that were mentioned. And in terms of the content of this webinar, the Ending Impunity that describes the various layers of exploitation and some of the creative struggles and of the participants in this panel to really try to create a context where land can be protected, where communities can be protected, but it's a coalition. And so clearly investors need to step up and participate in that. But I'd also, like to thank Forest Peoples Program, Global Witness, also those that have been working on these webinars, the Business and Human Rights Resource Center, the International Service for Human Rights. We have 2 exceptional translators that have been working with us today, Carla Davidson and Maria Jose Castro. We thank you for your participation and enabling us to really communicate English, Spanish, Spanish, English. We at the Investor Alliance for Human Rights will continue to work with these organizations along with Zero Tolerance Initiative, Global Witness, et cetera, to further the goals and some of the strategies of peoples on the ground that are literally, in too many cases, giving their lives for this struggle. So as an investor community doing our due diligence, because we have an investor responsibility to protect human rights and to protect environmental human rights defenders as a part of that responsibility. And we can only be effective if we're deeply committed to the communities on the ground. And it's a tremendous opportunity and also an honor to work with people that are, every day trying to protect the various aspects of life, which are all deeply embedded in human rights instruments, but to make them real on the ground. So we look forward to continuing this conversation. Thank you for every participant that has come to this webinar, and we will be getting the information to you and encouraging you to read some of the reports that have mentioned by our speakers, so that we finally have a deeper sense of awareness. But then, you know, as the one question said, well, why are investors missing some of the data and being able to act when companies are literally destroying community life and livelihood? So thank you so much to all, and we wish you the good rest of your day, morning, noon, and evening, and look forward to ongoing conversations with you. Thank you so much. Bye-bye. Thank you.